Most people who read about the high priest's breastplate do the same thing. They see a list of 12 gemstones, sardius, topaz, carbuncle, and on down the rows. Their eyes slide across the names the way you'd skim a jewelry catalog, and then they move on to the next chapter. And in doing that, they miss the single strangest detail in the entire object. Because this was never really about the stones. There was something folded inside it. A hidden pocket sewn into the cloth, and what was kept in that pocket could answer questions no human being could answer. It could tell a king whether to march to war. It could name a thief in a crowd of thousands. And one day, quietly without a single prophet announcing it, it would fall silent and vanish from Israel and never come back. Keep that hidden pocket in the back of your mind. We'll come back to it. But start here. Picture a man walking into the dark. Once a year, on the one day it was allowed, the high priest stepped through a heavy veil into a room with no windows and no lamp of its own. The innermost chamber of the tabernacle, the place they believed the presence of God actually rested. He went in alone, and on his chest, catching what little light bled through the veil behind him, were 12 stones set in gold. Red, green, blue, deep violet, each one flashing with a name cut into its face. He carried them over his heart into the most dangerous room a human being could enter. And if you had asked him what they were, he would not have said jewelry. Here's what most people miss. This is not a decoration. This is not a badge of rank the way a general wears medals. And it is not a good luck charm, a bit of holy costume to make the priest look important. It was something stranger and heavier than any of those. It was a nation. 12 tribes, hundreds of thousands of people. Every family and every feud and every frightened child, among them all of it, pressed into 12 stones and worn over one man's heartbeat as he walked into the presence of God. That is the thesis I want you to hold on to for the next half hour, because everything we look at will circle back to it. The breastplate was not an ornament. It was an entire people carried on the heart of one man, wrapped around a lost instrument of God's own voice, and hidden in plain sight, a blueprint of heaven itself. You've felt a smaller version of what that means. You know how it feels to carry someone. Not on your back, on your mind. A name you can't stop saying in the dark. A face you keep in your wallet, or now on the lock screen of your phone, so that the people you love are the first thing you see and the last thing you touch. You carry them into rooms they'll never enter. Into the doctor's office. Into the interview. Into the argument. That instinct to keep the ones who matter pressed close to you when you step into the moment that decides everything is old. It is older than you think. And roughly 3,000 years ago, God built that instinct into gold and cloth and told a man to wear it. His name was Aaron. He was the older brother of Moses, the first high priest of Israel, and he did not volunteer for this. Moses came down off a mountain with instructions so detailed they run for chapters, the exact cloth, the exact colors, the exact stones in the exact order, and among all of it was this square of woven gold and linen, folded double worn on the chest. In the ancient text, it has a name of its own. In Hebrew, it's called the Hoshen. Most Bibles translate that as breastplate, which makes you picture armor, a sheet of metal to stop an arrow. But that translation may be hiding something, because several scholars trace the word back to a root that means a fold-a-pouch, a thing that holds a thing that carries something hidden inside it. Sit with that for a second. The object's own name might not mean the thing that protects. It might mean the thing that hides. And that is exactly what it did. Because before we ever get to the 12 stones on the front, the part everyone looks at, we have to deal with what was tucked into the fold behind them. The part nobody looks at. The part that made grown kings stop breathing while they waited for it to speak. So let's open the fold. Inside that doubled square of cloth, the text says the high priest carried 2 objects. Their names are the Urim and the Thummim. And I want to be honest with you right away, because most videos won't be, nobody knows for certain what they were. Not the rabbis, not the archaeologists, not the church fathers. They are one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Hebrew Bible. But the words themselves crack the door open. Urim comes from the Hebrew root for light, the same root behind the word for fire, for illumination, for the flare of dawn. Thummim comes from a root meaning completeness, wholeness, perfection. lights and perfections, held in a pouch over the heart. The two objects through which for centuries the God of Israel was believed to answer yes and no. Think about how strange that is. Not a prophet in a trance, not a voice in a burning bush, a pair of objects in a fabric pocket that somehow carried a verdict. That's why the breastplate has a second name in the text, not the breastplate of beauty, not the breastplate of gold, but the breastplate of judgment. The word for judgment there, mishpat, means a legal decision, a ruling handed down. This wasn't a fashion piece. It was closer to a courtroom you could wear. And here is the line that pins it down, spoken by God to Moses about what goes into that pouch. And thou shalt put in the breastplate of judgment, the Urim and the Thummim. And they shall be upon Aaron's heart when he goeth in before the Lord. Upon his heart, when he goeth in before the Lord. Every time the priest walked toward that dark inner room, the mechanism for hearing God's answer went in with him, riding over his pulse. Now pull back and look at the whole garment, because the pouch was only one layer of it. The breastplate didn't hang on its own. It was fastened to a kind of sleeveless vest called the ephod tied on, with gold rings and blue cord, so that the text is weirdly insistent about this. The breastplate would never come loose from the ephod, never slip out of place over the heart. Whoever designed this did not want that piece drifting. And up on the shoulders of that vest sat two more stones, not the famous 12. Two large onyx stones, one on each shoulder, and on them were engraved the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, 6 names on the right shoulder, 6 on the left, carved into the stone like a royal seal. The text calls them stones of memorial. The high priest carried the names of the whole nation on his shoulders and on his heart at the same time. On the shoulders, the place you carry a weight, a burden, a load you bear. Over the heart, the place you carry the people you love. Strength and tenderness worn together on the same man at the same moment. That double image is not an accident, and it's worth slowing down for. Here's the part nobody tells you about that word, memorial. In English, it sounds backward-looking like a plaque for the dead. But the Hebrew zikaron doesn't mean a thing you remember fondly. It means a thing that causes remembering. A reminder aimed in a direction. And the direction here is stunning. The names were not carved so that Aaron would remember the people. They were carved, the text says, as a memorial before the Lord. Aaron was carrying the names of Israel into God's presence so that God would remember them. So that when the high priest stepped into that room, every tribe stepped in with him. The forgotten ones, the failures, the tribe that had disgraced itself, and the tribe nobody talked about, all of them on his heart, brought before God by name. And that is the sentence the entire breastplate is built around. Listen to it. And Aaron shall bear the names of the children of Israel in the breastplate of judgment upon his heart, when he goeth in unto the holy place for a memorial before the Lord continually. He shall bear the names upon his heart, continually, not once a year, not on the good days, continually, the whole nation always over the heart of the one allowed to go in. You are one of those stones. Hold that thought, because we haven't even reached the 12 yet, and when we do, you're going to find out we're not even sure what they were. Before we count, the stones feel the weight of them. 12 tribes. Reuben, who slept with his father's concubine and lost his birthright for it. Simeon and Levi, whose swords turned a whole town into a graveyard. Judah, who tried to have his own daughter-in-law killed before he learned the truth. These were not 12 tidy saints. This was a family with a criminal record, betrayals, jealousies, a brother sold into slavery by the other 11. And God's instruction was not, leave the shameful ones off the breastplate. It was the opposite. Every tribe gets a stone. The ones who failed most. The ones with the worst names. Cut them into gems and set them in gold, and carry them over the heart into my presence by name, all 12 continually. You already know why that lands. Because you know what it is to be the tribe with the record. You know the version of yourself you'd leave off the breastplate if you could. The year you don't talk about the thing, you did the person you were. And the whole logic of this object is that God said no. That one comes in too, on the heart, by name. That's the pattern the breastplate performs over and over, and it's why it's worth understanding stone by stone. So let's finally look at them. And this is where it gets strange, because the moment you try to say what the 12 stones actually were, the ground opens under you. Here is the first row in the old words: a sardius, a topaz, and a carbuncle. Sounds precise, doesn't it? It isn't. Take the very first stone. In Hebrew, it's odem, and the root of that word simply means red. That's the solid part. It was a red stone. But which one? For centuries, people read sardius and pictured one thing, while others translated the same word as ruby and pictured another. And here's the catch that gives the whole video its title. The ruby was almost certainly not even known in that part of the world when the breastplate was made. So the confident red gem on 1,000 church paintings may be a stone that didn't exist yet in Aaron's hands. The honest answer is it was red, probably a carnelian, and the rest is a guess dressed up as a fact. Now watch that problem multiply. Look down the rows and you hit sapphire. Every instinct in you reads that as sapphire. Of course, it's sapphire. The word is right there. But nearly every serious scholar who has studied it says the same thing. The stone the ancient world called sapphire was almost certainly not our sapphire at all. It was lapis lazuli, a deep blue rock flecked with gold, the stone of Egyptian kings, the blue you see in Tutankhamun's mask. Read the word picture, the wrong stone. The name itself is a kind of hiding place, and it keeps going. One stone in the old translations is called a diamond, except diamond cutting didn't exist yet, and a raw diamond would have been the last thing you could carve a tribe's name into. Another is called a ligure, a word so obscure that translators have argued over it for 1,000 years. Row by row, the list you thought was a simple inventory turns into a set of question marks. Two teams of researchers have spent recent years trying to nail it down. One group comparing the Hebrew names against the actual gemstones dug out of ancient Egypt, another working across the whole ancient Near East and claiming at last to have matched 11 of the 12 with real confidence. 11 of 12, after 3,000 years. And that's the optimistic count. So sit with the first layer of what this breastplate hid. It hid its own materials. The single most detailed piece of clothing described in the Hebrew Bible, measured to the finger's width, colored to the thread, and we cannot say for sure what half the stones on it were. The names survived. The stones went dark, which, if you've been paying attention, is a small rehearsal of the larger thing that's coming. Because losing certainty about the stones is one thing. Losing the voice inside them was going to be another. If any of this is already changing how you picture that chapter you thought you'd skip. That's exactly the point of this channel, so take a second and subscribe, because the strangest turn in this whole story is still ahead. We've lost track of what the stones were. Now let's find out what they could do. For most of the objects in the ancient world, we can guess how they worked. This one, we mostly can't. And that's part of what makes it grip you. We know what the Urim and Thummim were for. We just don't know the mechanics. When a leader faced a decision too big to reason his way through, go to war, or wait, pursue the enemy, or hold the line guilty man or innocent man, he didn't call a council. He went to the priest, and the priest wearing the breastplate somehow put the question to God and came back with a yes or a no. That's the part the text is sure about. The how is the fog. Watch it happen in a single scene. Moses is at the end of his life. He's about to die on a mountain without ever setting foot in the promised land, and the nation he dragged out of Egypt is about to be handed to a younger man named Joshua. And God's instructions for how Joshua is supposed to lead, how this untested successor is supposed to know God's will after Moses is gone, come down to this. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall ask counsel for him after the judgment of Urim before the Lord. Read that slowly. The single greatest human authority in Israel is dying, and the backup system God installs is not another Moses. It's a priest, a breastplate, and the Urim. The pouch over the heart becomes the nation's way of hearing heaven. That's how central this thing was. And you can see the handover moment itself quiet and almost tender on the day Aaron was first dressed as high priest. Moses does it with his own hands. And he put the breastplate upon him also. He put in the breastplate the Urim and the Thummim. He put it in, one brother clothing another, tucking the voice of God into the fold of cloth over his heart, and stepping back. From that day, Israel had a way to ask. So how did the answer come? Here, the honest historian shrugs, and the honest teacher should too. Some believe it was a form of sacred lot. 2 stones, or 2 sides, one meaning yes and one meaning no, drawn or cast so that the outcome wasn't the priest's opinion, but God's verdict. There's a strange telling moment that supports this. King Saul early on is trying to find out where guilt lies, and he prays a line that almost sounds like he's describing the machine itself, asking God to give a perfect lot to show one answer or its opposite. It reads like a coin flip with the divine hand on it. Others believed something far stranger was going on with the stones, and that belief takes us to the reason the Greeks who saw this thing walked away, calling it by a name they usually reserved for their own gods. But before we get there, plant this where you won't lose it. 12 stones. Names of the tribes cut into gems worn into the presence of God. I want you to keep your eye on those 12 stones the way you'd keep your eye on a face in a crowd, because 1,000 years after this, on a prison island, a man in exile is going to look up and see these exact 12 stones again. Not on a priest, holding up a city. We'll get there. For now, back to the light. Now we reach the part that sounds like legend, except it comes from a witness who had actually seen the temple with his own eyes. His name was Josephus, a Jewish priest turned historian writing in the 1st century, close enough to the real thing that his own relatives had served in the temple. And Josephus records a tradition about the breastplate that he clearly believed and expected his readers to take seriously. He says the stones shone, not reflected light shone. He describes how before the army of Israel marched out to battle, a brilliance would break from the stones of the breastplate, a light bright enough that the whole people could see it, and they understood it to mean one thing: God was going with them. The verdict wasn't spoken. It was radiant. Stay with me, because Josephus adds a detail that turns the wonder into something almost unbearably sad. He says the Greeks who encountered this, who could not deny what they were seeing, gave the breastplate a name. They called it the oracle. The pagan world had oracles of its own, smoke and riddles and priestesses, and when they met the God of Israel's version, this pouch of light over a man's heart, they reached for the highest word they had, the oracle. And then Josephus writes the sentence that should stop you cold. He says that in his own day, the stones had gone dark. The breastplate had stopped shining. He writes 200 years before he sat down to compose his history, and he tells you why. Because God had grown displeased with the people's sins. Read that again. A man is holding the memory of a light. His own grandfathers might have seen writing it down precisely because it was already gone. The oracle had fallen silent. The stones still existed. The shining did not. Do you feel what that is? That's the sound of a door closing so slowly that no one hears it latch. There was no announcement. No prophet stood up and said, "Today the light leaves." It just dimmed. A generation that had seen it grew old and died, and the next generation had only the story, and the one after that wondered if the story was ever true. That is almost always how the most precious things are lost. Not stolen in a single night, just slowly stopped being there while everyone was busy, until one day someone reaches for the light out of habit and finds only stone. And this is the moment to name the second thing the breastplate hid, the deeper one under the mystery of the stones. It didn't only hide what it was made of. In the end, it hid the fact that it was leaving. The most direct line to the voice of God that Israel ever wore over its heart went quiet in stages, and by the time anyone thought to write down what it had been, they were writing an obituary. Which raises the question the whole back half of this story turns on. What happens to a people when the voice they carried over their heart stops answering? If this is hitting you somewhere real, if you know what it is to pray toward a silence, then before we walk into that silence with them, take 1 second and subscribe. Because what God does with that silence is the entire reason this story doesn't end in the dark. To feel how much was lost, you have to watch one man reach for the light and find it gone. His name was Saul, the first king of Israel, and by the end of his story, he is a portrait of what it looks like when the voice goes quiet. The Philistine army is massing. Saul can see the size of it, and the text says his heart trembled greatly. So he does the thing kings did. He goes to ask. He wants a yes or a no from God, the way Joshua got it, the way the breastplate was built to give it. And here is the verse, and it is one of the loneliest in the Hebrew Bible. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him, not neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Neither by Urim. The mechanism was still there. The priesthood existed, the stones existed, the pouch was still sewn over someone's heart, and nothing came out of it. The line that had carried God's answers for generations for this man on this night gave back silence. And notice what Saul does next, because it's what people always do when the true voice goes quiet. He goes looking for a fake one. That same night, he sneaks off to a medium, a woman who claims to speak with the dead, and begs her for the answer God wouldn't give. A king who once had the oracle now crouching in the dark, asking a spiritualist for directions. That is the whole tragedy of a lost voice in one image. When the real light dims, we don't stop needing an answer. We just start accepting counterfeits. And then history did to the whole nation what that night did to Saul. Centuries later, Jerusalem fell. The temple burned. The people were dragged into exile in Babylon. And somewhere in that catastrophe, the Urim and the Thummim slip out of the story entirely, no dramatic exit, just gone. And we know the exact moment the loss became official, because it's recorded in the driest, most heartbreaking way. When a remnant finally straggles back from exile to rebuild, some men can't prove their priestly bloodline. There's a dispute about who's allowed to serve. And the ruling is that these men must wait to eat the holy food. Wait for a decision, until in the words of the text, there stood up a priest with Urim and with Thummim. Until there stood up a priest with Urim and with Thummim. Do you hear what that sentence is admitting? They no longer had them. The judge who could settle the question was gone, and everyone knew it. And the official position of the nation of Israel became, we'll figure this out when the voice comes back. And the voice did not come back. Not through the stones. The breastplate that had carried a nation over the heart, wrapped around the light of God's own answer, was now carrying names into a silence. The pocket was empty. The oracle was history. This is the point in the story where if it were only about an artifact, we'd be done. A remarkable object, gloriously described, mysteriously lost. Fade out. But it was never only about the artifact. Remember the promise I made you at the very beginning, the 12 stones and a man in exile who would see them again holding up a city. He's about to walk on, and what he sees turns this entire story inside out. The man's name was John, and where the story finds him is the whole point. He is old now, the last of the 12 who walked with Jesus according to the tradition, and he has been exiled to a hard little island called Patmos, a rock in the sea used as a prison. He is the picture of a man who should have nothing left. Cut off from the temple. Cut off from Jerusalem. Cut off from the world. If ever there were a place where the voice of God would stay silent, it's a prison island at the end of a life. And it's there in exile that John is shown the end of the whole story, a vision of a new heaven and a new earth, and a city coming down out of the sky. The New Jerusalem. And when he describes the foundations of that city, listen to what he reaches for. And the foundations of the wall of the city were garnished with all manner of precious stones. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third a chalcedony, the fourth an emerald. And on he goes. 12 foundations. 12 stones. Jasper, sapphire. Emerald, sardonyx. Topaz, amethyst. If those names are starting to sound familiar, they should, because this is the breastplate, the same family of stones that Israel had carried over its heart and then lost in the dark carnelian and lapis, and beryl and amethyst. Show up again at the very end of the Bible, no longer set in a pouch on a dying priest, but built into the foundations of a city that will never fall. The 12 stones didn't disappear. They got bigger. They went from something a man carried into God's presence to something that holds God's presence up forever. Do you see the shape of it now? Go back to the beginning. The breastplate carried the names of 12 tribes into a room once a year through a veil on the heart of one frightened man who might not come out. In John's vision, the names are on the 12 foundations of the city, out in the open permanent, holding up the streets where everyone lives. What was worn for a moment is now built for eternity. What one man carried close to his chest is now the ground under everyone's feet. And then John notices the thing that finishes the story, the detail that answers every silence in it. He looks around this glowing city for the one building he'd expect to be at its center, the temple, the holy place, the room behind the veil where the priest carried the stones. And it isn't there. And I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it. No temple, no veil, no inner room a man enters alone and afraid, no pouch because there's no more waiting on an answer. The one who gave the answers is standing in the open, and the city itself is the meeting place. This is what the breastplate was hiding all along, not just its stones, not just its lost voice. It was hiding a blueprint. Every strange feature of it, the names cut in gems, the nation carried on the heart. The stones that shone and then went dark was a small wearable model of something that could not yet be built. A rough sketch in gold and cloth of a day when God's people wouldn't be carried into his presence by a priest for a single trembling moment, but would live inside it. The high priest's chest was a scale drawing of heaven worn for 1,500 years before the real thing came down out of the sky. Which means the silence back in Babylon was never the end of the sentence. The Urim went quiet, yes. The stones stopped shining. The pocket emptied. But the answer they'd been waiting for wasn't lost. It was coming in a form so much larger than a pouch of light that no one recognized it was the same promise. The breastplate asked a question every time the priest walked into the dark. Will God receive these people by name? And the last chapter of the Bible answers it not with a stone, but with a city. So let's go back to where we started and close the circle. A man walks into the dark, once a year alone through a veil into the one room where the presence of God rested, and over his heart, catching the last of the light 12 stones with 12 names, an entire nation pressed to the chest of one man who wasn't sure he'd walk back out. That was the beginning. Hold that image against the ending. A city with no veil, no inner room, no priest walking in. Afraid because the 12 stones are the foundations, now the names are out in the daylight, and God is no longer behind the curtain. He's the light of the streets. The man carrying the nation into the presence became a city where the nation simply lives in it. That's the arc of the whole thing. So let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of this. First, the fact. The high priest's breastplate was never jewelry. It was the breastplate of judgment, a wearable courtroom folded around the Urim and the Thummim, the lost instrument through which Israel heard God's yes and no until it went dark so quietly that a historian had to write down that the light was already gone. That's the history, and it's stranger and sadder and more beautiful than the list of stones ever let on. Second, what it means for you. You are not a spectator to this object. You are on it. The whole logic of that breastplate is that God does not carry the impressive tribes and leave off the shameful ones. Every tribe got a stone, the failures the ones with the record, the names you'd have quietly dropped. If you have ever been sure you were the one who'd be left off the heart of God, the breastplate was built stone by stone to tell you that you were carried in by name. And third, the part I most want you to feel. The silence was never the end. There was a generation that reached for the light and found only stone that prayed toward a God who answered them, not that filed their unanswered questions away for a priest who never came. And they were not abandoned. The answer was on its way in a form bigger than a pouch of light, a city coming down out of heaven with their names built into its foundations forever. So if you're living in the quiet right now, praying into a silence reaching for a light that used to be there, and finding cold stone, this ancient breastplate has one thing to say to you across 3,000 years. The stones went dark. The names did not. You are still being carried. And the city is still coming. Here's my question for you, and I read the comments. Which tribe do you feel like the one with the record? The one nobody talks about? The one you're sure would have been left off? Tell me below and tell me why. I want to know. If this opened up a chapter you thought you'd skip. That's what this whole channel is for. Subscribe and stay with me because the next stone we turn over is stranger than this one. You were carried in by name. Don't forget it.